Okay, cool. All right, thanks again for being on the call. This is the third call, and it's the first one on actual solutions. In case you didn't know, this is the Making Lemonade Solution Summer Study, and the reason why it's called Making Lemonade is because when life gives you lemons, you make lemonade, aka solutions to the climate and economic crisis and all the crises. So that's why it's Making Lemonade. So then on this call, we'll be getting into different theories of change, leverage points, and strategies to create system change. And for the summer, the plan is to do so the last call was on personal stake, and the next call will be on economic movements, past economic solutions and systems that have tried and failed, and what are their pros and cons, what are their limitations. And then the fifth call will be on reinvestment in our power, so the reinvestment project, and how that relates to past solutions. And also its limitations and pros. And lastly, the sixth call will be on campaigning and how to bring all this knowledge about reinvestment, about solutions, about systems thinking to your campus. So the goals for this call are to, 1, understand theory of change as a concept and be able to apply it. 2, understand the leverage points framework as a way to analyze solutions and then be able to use it as a tool to understand the degree to which a solution is useful, because if you don't understand the extent to which a solution is useful, you can't argue against it or defend your own solution. And then we'll go into analyzing a few solutions. So that's the overall arc for this call. And I want to be transparent and say that on this call, the purpose is really to play around with different strategies, and our movement does not have a single solution, as I'm sure you know, and no movements really have a single solution because there are many. And what we're doing here is offering a set of tools to design strategy, and we need to think about the complex systems that we're in, the complex ecosystem of solutions that we have, and keep an eye towards deeper change. So that's just the intro. So I have a document here that you all can use. One second. Can use to participate, and then we'll keep track of the participation. Or I mean, if you want to see what people are writing, you can look at it. So we're going to be using this doc so people can be engaged and put down their thoughts if you don't get a chance to speak. But I definitely encourage you to speak up, and if you have a thought to say. Yeah. Okay, so my first question is, how many of you know what a theory of change is? Just raise your hand if you've heard of it before and you know what it is. And no. I think there's a few. Yeah, most people, a good amount of you know what that is. Okay. And can someone give me oh, sorry, one second. Yeah, can someone give me a definition of a theory of change? Just go for it. I know you all raised your hand, so.
It's been explained to me in the past as sort of like in an if-then statement, like if we do this, then this will happen. So like a way to get from here to there, and what happens when we do a certain kind of thing, and where will that take us?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, that's great, and that's exactly what I would have said too. Can someone give me examples of theories of change? Can several people just throw them out? Say, if this happens, then that will happen. Anyone, just throw them out. Or you can write into the doc. You can also speak if you will.
Ileana, where is the doc? I'm sorry that I'm on my phone.
Oh, I put it on the chat. Sorry. You can just speak
okay.
if you don't have to type on the doc. It's just
Got
for
it.
people that are feeling shy. But Joe, can you give me a theory of change?
Sure. I guess like class struggle is sort of the main mode of change under like the Marxist theory of change. But I guess that would be one example.
But could you elaborate? Like, if this happens, then what happens? Like, can you frame it in that kind of sentence?
Okay. If like if a bunch of members of a community or workers go on strike, they could force they could force like the terms of their struggle on some bosses, like or administrators in the case of students, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the kind of thing that you mean?
Sure. Or like here's one that someone put down in the document. If workers own the means of production, then we can equitably redistribute wealth towards those that do the work. So yeah, maybe for your example could be, if workers strike, they have more power and have more control over their salaries. Something like that. So, and we have here for divestment, if we divest, then we contribute to undermining the fossil fuel industry's social and political power, and which, in turn leads to indirect influence on policies and affecting climate change and all of that. So it's just a series of if-then statements. And it's basically a theory of change. It's pretty formulaic, but something, before we go into it actually, can someone tell me why a theory of change is important? Min?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I think other people can too.
Yeah. I would say the theory of change is important because despite how formulaic it is, it helps set strategy and narrative so that you have a map in place and guidelines so that it gives a way to plan things out in terms of campus campaigns, and so that you know what your goals are, or you have a good base from which to start a healthy conversation on what your goals should be.
I like that answer. Thank you.
Yeah.
Totally. And it's definitely helpful in our divestment campaigns, but even broader, just any sort of debate, any sort of conversation where someone is talking to you and you just don't understand what they're saying, or they don't understand where you're coming from. But if you understand that their underlying belief, like their underlying assumptions, like if this happens and that happens, you're like, oh, okay, now I understand why we were having this miscommunication. But that's totally, for strategy, theory of change is really important. So I think in order to make this tool or this concept useful in our context, we're going to hone into a climate change focus. So let's talk about some examples of theories of change to fix climate change. These are any ways that we've been told or we understand that we can provide solutions to fix climate change. Can people just throw them out or fill it in the doc?
If we sit in a room where international negotiators are, then we will be able to fix the international rules.
Mm-hmm. Totally. About climate change too, yeah. If we go to these COP conference of parties every year, we're gonna do it. We're gonna fix it all together.
Like if we recycle, we can stop global warming.
Mm-hmm.
If we increase Okay. If we increase the carbon carrying capacity of the Earth, then we can slow down, have more time to adjust to climate change.
Mm-hmm. If individuals can just change their behavior, then we'll fix climate change. We'll stop polluting the atmosphere. Yeah. What else?
If we never shower, there will be more water.
And more stinky.
If we price carbon sufficiently that it is no longer profitable to extract fossil fuels, fossil fuel extraction will stop.
Mm-hmm. Okay, a few more. Couple more.
If we transition to renewable energy, everything will be better.
If we increase public information about the activities of fossil fuel companies, it will make us more able to organize around fighting them.
Mm-hmm.
If the state seizes energy production, it will somehow magically be more democratic.
Mm. Okay, so that's a solid list of theories of change and solutions geared towards fixing the climate crisis, right? Some other ones are, I don't know if you've heard of the UN RED program. It's like a deforestation. It's a way to reduce emissions and deforestation. But for instance, their goal is, the overall development goal of the program is to reduce forest emissions and enhance carbon stocks in forests while contributing to national sustainable development. So they believe if they can just harness the emissions in forests and stop deforestation, we'll fix climate change. And someone mentioned, if we just create a worldwide climate agreement, will fix the climate catastrophe. Or if we divest, or if we block the construction of pipelines, then we'll stop climate change. All of these are examples. And so what's important in all of these is the theories themselves, but also what you have, the assumptions underlying them. So what do you have to believe in order to believe that theory is true? So what are the assumptions that you have to absorb in order to say, okay, I will fight for that belief, that idea, that solution, that tactic, that strategy. So let's think about what are some assumptions behind those theories. So let's talk about the UN one. What are some assumptions about, having these large climate conferences? What are some assumptions in that?
That the agreements reached in climate conferences will make a difference in international policy.
Mm-hmm.
I would say, go for it, Kingo.
That change comes from the top down.
Mm-hmm. That's a huge one.
But countries will follow through on their commitments.
Mm-hmm.
There's also this idea that we can't take any steps, or any concrete action can't be taken until we unite under this agreement, until we all believe that climate change is real and everyone says that 2 degrees is the agreed upon limit. What else? What about the theory of change with the carbon stocks in the atmosphere, or implementing a carbon tax or something like that? What are some assumptions?
I think a major one in both of those examples is that the governments can effectively manipulate markets in producing material and biological effects that these top-down, say a carbon tax would have a trillion financial implications that would then have the actual effects on the material natural world.
Mm-hmm.
I think another one is that in order for any important policy or effective policy to work, both America and China have to be on board, and there's very little emphasis put on other countries.
True. What about with divestment? What are the assumptions that we hold dear but don't necessarily verbalize?
That the government will listen to our institutions if they take a stand,
Mm-hmm.
and then that the government has the power to take action.
That our institutions are powerful.
Hmm.
That students have power, right? That us being in the media will somehow affect policies that are being written right now, that will affect politics and the election cycle, and will therefore, at some point somehow prevent climate change. Any more assumptions that you can think of right now?
I think a big one was always that it will lead to more.
Mm-hmm.
That there's that big assumption that it will have that effect.
Lead to more what?
Yeah, I think that's as far as it often got.
All right.
More kinds of organized climate action.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Okay. Any last thoughts on assumptions? Okay. So the reason why we're talking about assumptions is because oftentimes assumptions stem from our worldview and about how we understand the world around us and the systems around us. And so assumptions mold our theory of change, which in turn affect our strategy, our map of how we create change, and ultimately affect the change itself, right? Or lack of, which is sometimes the case. And something that's important we can't always change our assumptions, and we can't always change our theories about how we create change. But if we don't address these assumptions, and we can't shift the terrain of struggle that we're battling on. So for example, I was talking to Hannah Jones about this, and she helped, we talked about the content for this call, and she brought up the DREAM Act. She said that the DREAM Act, which gives access to education to undocumented immigrants, it relies on the dominant assumption that there are good immigrants and bad immigrants, that there are hardworking people who should deserve to go to school, and because they're contributing members of society, they get good grades, And so they made a strategic decision to use that assumption in order to win this campaign, because they would receive short-term gains. And this was effective because it relied on the current paradigm, but at the same time, it was harmful and received criticism because people said, you're perpetuating these stereotypes and these notions of good versus bad immigrants, that some people deserve education and to stay in the country and others don't, that some people are better than others. And so I think something that comes out of that example is that sometimes it's okay to make strategic decisions, and we can't fight all the battles at once. And sometimes we need to win certain battles in order to move on to larger ideological battles that we're fighting. But ultimately, we need to keep an eye towards shifting beliefs and assumptions, so we don't have to continue fighting on that terrain, on those battles of whether humans deserve to live, whether certain people deserve to live over others. And that being said, there are some compromises sometimes. And so another thing is that I think when discussing solutions, we want to prevent, usually the climate movement has focused on creating a dichotomy between real and false solutions. So carbon tax is a false solution, and the RED program is a false solution. Or reinvestment, or I mean, not reinvestment, but different policies as false solutions, and that the real ones are the ones that are geared towards communities, geared towards localized energy and cooperatives and all of that. But honestly, I don't think it's useful to create that dichotomy, and instead see each solution as a puzzle inside a larger puzzle, a puzzle piece inside a larger puzzle, rather than just an isolated puzzle piece that does not have a puzzle, you know? Think of it as solution to a larger system that's changing instead of just a Band-Aid end of the pipe solution. And also understand that there is some truth, or like there are benefits to even some of the weakest solutions. That being said, we should still push to the more strong, to work on the stronger solutions. Great, so that was just sort of an introduction to theory of change, and this will help us prep and transition into the conversation about leverage points. So does anyone have any questions around theory of change? No? Okay. All right.
It was pretty dense.
That's sarcasm. Okay. There's one thing I wanted to say is that there's a difference. Usually I and other people tend to think of this idea that there are different truths, that there's truth in every idea. There's truth in even like the right wing and the left wing, and in politics there's a little bit of truth in everything. And I think it's important to distinguish truth in solutions and then truth in reality, because I think a lot of times people get confused about, oh, there's different, if you assume that there are different truths, you believe that there are different realities, and that's not the case. Like there is one reality, that there is extreme poverty. There is the reality that there is extreme inequality. There is the reality that climate change exists. And when people think that there's a debate about that reality, that's when things get confusing and change doesn't happen. So I want to distinguish that truth with the truth inside strategy, because there are different benefits and different degrees of success contained, or different degrees of potential within each strategy, within each solution. So there are different truths within those solutions, but the reality is the same. And we're not here to question that reality. We're here to question the solutions. So I just wanted to make that distinction clear, because it's easy to confuse the two sometimes, and I think it's important when really analyzing solutions. Okay, so I think I'm gonna get into the Donella Meadows piece and her leverage points. I hope some of you had a chance to read it. We'll still be going through it and talking about the different points. I actually read this piece in my ecological and social systems class at Columbia, and this is probably the most valuable thing I learned in that class, and probably the only thing that I learned in that class, besides the fact that systems are complex. And we just kept repeating that. But when I sent out this email, I realized that a girl named Lehigh from Dartmouth, I think she was going to get on the call. I'm not sure if she's on. She actually wrote a book about this, which I didn't realize until after I sent the email, and that's really awesome. So I'll be sending that out for homework, her book, free book, and an article. So that was kind of really exciting. And hopefully, if she's on the call, she can give us some insights at the end. So, okay, I'm gonna do a quick screen share. Okay, 1 second. fixing that? Okay, here we go. This way. Okay. So leverage points. Actually, before we go into this, I just want to say, how many people have actually heard of Donella Meadows and the leverage points before doing this reading? No? Oh, a few people. Okay, but most people haven't. Okay. So I think a lot of people, can everyone see this, the slides? Can you see the 100 kilogram thing? Can you, Jenny? Yeah, okay, cool. Okay, so I think, so leverage points are, there's actually there's a concept in physics called torque. I'm not sure if some of you are aware of this, but basically it's this idea that if you have, for instance, a seesaw, as shown in this picture, you can see that if you add a distance, so more length, you can use less effort, so less weight, less mass, to balance out the weight or the force on the other side. And so the idea behind levers is to use that concept. So the more powerful, the stronger your force is on, the stronger your strategy is, the less effort you need in order to move the weight on the other side, to create that change, to create that system change. So that's just the concept that I'm trying to show here with this picture. And then, one second. Okay, yeah, so that's just, I just wanted to say that there's an actual practical metaphor here. For some people who are more math oriented or something. But yeah, I just want to, before we get into the actual topics, we're gonna do, can someone tell me just like the main, your initial thoughts on this piece? Anything that really stuck out to you, something that you hope to talk about in the future? For those of you who read it, just one thing that, your initial thoughts on the reading.
One thing that really stuck out to me was the way that she differentiated between physical changes in the system, information, and control, and how some of those can be changes that will impact people's day-to-day survival, and others are ones that will impact much longer-term changes.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd definitely like to talk about how that impacts what's important to fight for in a given campaign and in a given timeline.
Mm-hmm. Other initial thoughts?
I think I understood what she was talking about in the context of like her examples, but then was having trouble thinking about how to apply them in other ways. So I definitely like to talk about that.
One thing that really stood out to me was point 4, self-organization, and how I guess models of flexibility and allowing people to be accountable to each other and to themselves almost has this magic quality, and how powerful flexibility and evolution can be in systems.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Any other thoughts? Okay. Okay. So I mentioned this earlier, and definitely the reason why we're studying this is because of the way that it leads to our strategic thinking and can help us think more strategically. But also, I think it's important to understand where people are coming from and understand, because sometimes we'll listen to someone's argument and where it's just so confusing, or you just don't understand like why they would think that, or why they don't understand you or where you're coming from. However, usually people that we have arguments with have good intentions and actually do want to create change. So it's good to be able to understand their arguments, where they're coming from, and be able to defend your own and advocate for your way of thinking. But also understand that there are some benefits to the solutions that they might be presenting or advocating for. And I think it's interesting because oftentimes when you're with this idea that if you do this instead, you'll have more power to create change. People get defensive when you criticize their strategy because they don't want to admit that they're wrong, or they don't want to admit that they're wasting time and energy, even though oftentimes their strategies just aren't powerful. So there's something to be said about being tactful when having conversations, instead of attacking the person, attacking their argument and attacking the root of the problem in their argument. So I think I'm going to ask someone to read aloud the 12 leverage points. We're not going to get too much into them, but we'll divide it up into 4. So the first person read the top 3, or the 12 to 10, 9 to 7, 6 to 4, 3 to 1. So let me just do the screen share again, and we'll go over that. Okay, can someone read 12 to 10, please?
Numbers, constants, and parameters. From 12 to 1, right?
12 to 10.
Okay. Numbers, constants, and parameters such as subsidies, taxes, and standards. 11, buffers, the sizes of stabilizing stocks relative to their flows. 10, stock and flow structures, physical systems, and their nodes of intersection.
Thank you. Who can read the next 3?
I can. Delays, the lengths of time relative to the rates of system changes. 8, balancing feedback loops, the strength of the feedbacks relative to the impacts they are, and then it cuts off.
Oh, trying to correct.
Okay, trying to correct. And do you want me to do 7 as well?
7,
7, reinforcing feedback loops, the strength of the gain of driving loops.
Thank you. Who can read the next 3?
Information flows are the structure of who does and who does not have access to information. Rules are incentives, punishments, and constraints. And self-organization is the power to add, change, or evolve the system structure.
Thank you. And the last 3.
I can read those. 3, goals, the purpose or function of the system. Paradigms, 2, paradigms, the mindset out of which the system, its goals, structure, rules, delays, parameters arises. And 1, transcending paradigm.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, can anyone tell me any patterns that they see in this list? What are some main themes that you see stemming from this list of 12 leverage points?
They start to get really hard to change as you get closer to 1.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure how to change a transcending paradigm or impose a transcending paradigm on a large group.
Mm-hmm. What else?
I think they get to be more
No-
comprehensive. So like from smaller pieces to much larger pieces to, I mean, like was just said, to even greater than a system itself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm also noticing a definite distinction between like systemic inputs and systemic outputs, as well as the rules that structure how things work and the flows within the system. Once you've inputted things to determine what the outputs will be. I don't know what to call that.
Yeah. Thank you. So, as many of you alluded to, as you can see, so when you start from 12 and you get into the lesser half, I guess, you'll see that these are more shallow leverage points. So they don't go as deep in actually creating change, whereas the first 6 do have greater potential. And here it says they're under research, and I'm sure they are, but they're also more difficult to bring about. And then this chart here sort of also, it has the shallow and deep on the left, and then you can see the broader sort of buckets that they've classified these strategies or these places to intervene in a system. So the last 3 are really geared towards parameters, relatively mechanistic characteristics typically targeted by policymakers. So this is a lot of like physical infrastructure, the physical chemistry like carbon or whatever it is, money, anything that's really tangible. And then you go into feedbacks, so the interactions between elements within a system of interest that drive internal dynamics. So this is where you see the feedback loops that can be either balancing or reinforcing and relate to the delays and the flows. Thirdly, there's the design. So the social structures and institutions that manage feedbacks and parameters. So this is where the rules come in and the underlying foundation of how the system works. And then lastly, it's the intent. So the underpinning values, goals, and worldviews of actors that shape the emergent direction to which a system is oriented. So this is what we were talking about with beliefs and assumptions and theory of change. This is really about what you have to believe in order to assume that this is how a system is supposed to function and how we're supposed to create change within that system. So these are the main buckets. And for now, we're going to head into some breakout groups, and we'll break you up and each group will analyze one specific place to intervene in the system, not buckets, just a specific number. And here's the prompt. What are some strategies related to that leverage point? Like what would, for instance, what would changing the numbers look like? And then what's a group or campaign that's trying to do that? And lastly, what are the benefits and limitations to each strategy? So I'm going to break you up into groups. And on the document, I have here, so group 1 will do leverage point 1. Group 2 will do point 2. Group 3 will do point 6. Group 4 will do point 12. Group 5 will do point 3. And group 6, so I don't know how many people are on. I think we'll just do 5 groups. Yeah, we'll just do up to group 5. And then I'll copy in the questions that I just said. Actually, we'll do 4 groups. I can open this. No.
So
2, which means oops. Can't see chat. All of the previous messages. Wait, okay. So group 2, we're doing leverage point 2, which is paradigms. So, yeah. I forgot what the. I'm gonna put them in there. Don't worry. Oh, okay. I forgot what the first question was. What are some strategies related to the leverage points? Okay, yeah. Strategies, group work campaign that's using that strategy, and benefits and limitations. So, the paradigms is all about like challenging underlying assumptions to make like encouraging shifts in like how people do things. Right. Okay, let's bring it in. Okay, so let's hear from group 4. So the group that discussed numbers. Can y'all tell us what strategies would look like, what kind of groups or campaigns are organizing for that kind of change, and any benefits or limitations? You don't have to answer all of them, but just the main points that stuck out.
I was in that group that talked about numbers, and one thing that we talked about was how two of the campaigns that I thought of in regards to numbers are campaigns around carbon taxing and actually also divestment. So talking about how numbers like levels of carbon tax or valuation of carbon can change things sort of higher up the rank, I guess, and even how divestment, so like the amount of wealth that is divested, or the amount of, like the number of universities that divest, or all of these different numbers that we think of are supposed to create broader systems change. So creating sort of ripples up the line.
Thank you. Thank you for the report back. And what about group 3? Can you tell us about information flows?
So Emily reaffirmed how, because it's in the middle of the metaphorical lever diagram and is not changing the narrative or addressing the narrative overall itself, it's not the most influential leverage point per se. You kind of want to either hold off on it afterwards or just kind of deprioritize it, because just giving people the proof or like the scientific arguments or like just information alone is not going to convince them theory of change style.
Yeah, and we also talked about how it's important to show people like why you think the way you do, and like what the reasoning behind what the paradigm they're living in now is, and what you think can be changed, but that it's limited because it doesn't mean action. So you can just talk at people all you want, but they still doesn't change. It doesn't like automatically equal change.
Yeah.
Did you talk about any benefits to information flows and I guess access to information? Did you talk about that?
Yeah, it helps legitimize your argument. You can't not have like information or answers. Like if you don't know, why divestment from a financial and climate justice stance is important, then it's going to sound like you don't really know or care why you're in it. And most people right now, know what climate change is, but there will be times where you have to kind of like explain further why it's bad and how does it, matter. You need the legitimacy, you need to have answers, and being involved in divestment campaigns, you're in a divestment bubble sometimes because the majority of your time you're spending with other people who are already involved like you are. Like I didn't know that the UC system put money in oil until I got involved in fossil free, and now I know. That's one example.
Totally. And that's where all the statistics come in. And I think the one way I understand number 6 is just like metering, and how if you see how much energy you're wasting and you have a meter in the front of your house versus in the basement, like that changes your understanding of what's going on, and it makes you more cognizant of the change that needs to happen in order to prevent that from continuing to waste energy, or for recycling, for instance. If you don't know what to recycle, you're not going to do it. But at the very least, if you don't know how, But so, okay, thank you. And then what about group 2 on paradigms?
let's see. I guess I can summarize. With paradigms, those are like really going deep, the sort of like mindset and assumptions, basic assumptions that underlie people's worldview and their actions. And we talked about how it can be really good to change those, because once you change a person's whole like assumptions and worldview, you're going to totally change like their goals and the way that they approach problems. For example, we talked about taking a more like spiritual attitude towards climate change. It's not just something that impacts people individually, but impacts us spiritually as members of a global community, and that impacts everyone, not just certain countries. But how also there are limits to using paradigms to make change, because A, it can be very abstract, and so you need to actually pair paradigms, discussion of paradigms to discussion of how you can turn those into concrete action. And B, paradigms are often set by material conditions. So if a person is struggling economically and they're just focusing on their own survival day to day, their paradigm is going to be serving themselves. And talking is not really going to be able to change that. So you also have to focus on more immediate issues in order to really have leverage on the paradigms. We talked about how groups right now, especially groups that are doing like regenerative investment and just transition, are really good at pairing a whole discussion of the change of paradigms from an extractive economy to, like a communal and a sharing and an ecologically sustainable and socially just economy, and how that should be our end goal rather than personal profit. And pairing that with actual work to, build community power and renew communities that are major, sites of extraction and that have been sacrificial communities.
Getting
Does anyone else in my group want to add anything to that? Yeah.
What do you mean by end goal, actually? I had that question. How, like, the just transition...
Wait, sorry, what was that?
You mentioned something about, like, transitioning from the extractive economy and that being an end goal. Could you say more about that real quick?
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't want to go into, like, a whole big thing about explaining the just transition, since I imagine a lot of people here have heard about it before, but basically it's the idea that right now, especially under global capitalism, there are corporations and powerful nations will go into areas and just extract resources from an area. For example, they'll go into a community with a lot of timber, and they'll turn that into like a logging town that's entirely focused on clear cutting all the trees. And then once they've done that and made a profit off of that, they'll just completely abandon the community, and they'll just leave these economically depressed areas where that have ecologically been destroyed and economically have lost their main engine. And so those communities are sacrificial communities where their ecology is destroyed, but they don't really get any long-term benefits. And so the just transition is all about changing that whole paradigm to one from, it's about, corporations and wealthy nations making a profit off of these areas, to one that is about, and then leaving, to one where it's all about building community power long-term. So it's about giving communities control of their own resources and how they're used, and putting them in control of how those are sold, and making sure that they're the ones who actually reap the benefits, so that we can build a world that is sustainable as well as economically just.
Cool.
Sorry if that was overly long.
No, thank you for giving a review of the project, and we're going to get into that in a couple of calls. I guess I was just curious about the phrasing end goal, because as we see from like the transcending paradigms, we can hear from that group soon. I think that there's something to be said about like saying, oh, this is the one way to do it, or the one definitive solution, which is oftentimes how I thought about reinvestment in the beginning. I was one of the first students who started learning about the project, and I saw it as this like wonderful solution that would address all the problems. But I'm trying to, the reason why we're having these kinds of calls, and this one in particular, is to develop a critical lens to think about all the different solutions, including the ones that our movement is creating, and be able to challenge them and also defend it. So, but yeah, thank you. I totally agree with what you're saying. Did anyone else want to have any comments for that group? Okay, let's hear from group 1 on transcending paradigms. Group 1? I don't know who was in group 1.
Hey, this is Joe. That might have been us. We also didn't know what group we were in, so we actually didn't. I don't think we talked specifically about that leverage point. We just picked the one that we were interested in and talked about information flows. So unless there's somebody else who is group 1, that might have been how it happened.
Okay, well, sorry about that. That wasn't communicated clearly. But do you have anything to add on information flows? Joe?
Yeah, we talked a little bit about, I guess, some of the interconnectedness of the leverage points. How there was some ultimate goal of paradigm shift in kind of all of them. I guess that was one thing that we talked about. And so, like, for example, one could think about information flows from the perspective of kind of reclaiming narratives and it's just how that works with an overall paradigm and how information interacts and discourse interacts with a paradigm.
Okay, thank you. Does someone want to take a stab at number 1, transcending paradigms? Actually, Lehigh, are you still on the call?
Hey, it's Leahy. I'm here.
I'm sorry, I didn't pronounce it right. Lee? How do you say it? Leahy? Okay.
Leahy. Yeah.
Cool.
Don't worry about it.
Would you mind explaining number 1 and also just telling us a little bit about how you started working on the book and any learnings that you have that you want to share with us?
Sure. I guess I could talk a little bit and see if you have questions. I think, so backing up a little bit, I also came across this paper in a class I was in where I pretty much didn't learn anything else. And I was really fascinated by how so many of the things that we try to do as young climate justice organizers falls into one or more of these leverage points. And I came at this as someone who is an organizer, but also someone who's a researcher. I do research in the Arctic. So I really wanted to see if there was anything I could learn using these leverage points that could be useful to fellow organizers. So yeah, that's the gist of it. I think transcending paradigms is really interesting to me for a lot of reasons. I think oftentimes as organizers, we're always working on shifting paradigms, and to a certain extent, depending on how involved we are with this work, we are aware of those paradigms. But sometimes we are so locked into a specific way of thinking because of the communities we've built or the societies we are a part of that we don't necessarily think about how to transcend paradigms. And so, you know, beyond, I think, I guess I'm trying to organize all my thoughts here. But to me, transcending paradigms is about how do we move beyond just the way we think. So we could be thinking about how, like, we want to shift the mindset that is causing the current system we live in to exist. That system could be capitalism. And so capitalism has all these formal and informal rules, these controls on information flow. The system, this capitalist system, dictates how we live. And we acknowledge that, and we think about that paradigm. But when we move into a realm where we think about transcending that paradigm, we call the regime shift. So we can actually begin to move towards a completely different set of thoughts and values and structures and rules. And so that's something I find really interesting. Obviously, transcending paradigms is very difficult. That's why it's the highest on the list of leverage points. But to me, I think about all of these different leverage points, even the ones that might seemingly have a lower impact, as contributing to that ultimate goal of shifting paradigms and transcending those paradigms in the way we think. I don't know if that's really helpful, hopefully.
Thank you, I appreciate it. And thank you for getting on the call. Is there anything else you want to add for people who are just learning about this, or any major takeaways that you would, any advice or something?
Sure, I guess. So like you mentioned, I wrote a book and it's free. The whole point of it is it's action-based research. So it's meant to be helpful to people who are actually working on these issues. So I'd encourage you to read it, because it has a little bit more developed thoughts from me. But I guess what really brought me to leverage points is the way in which we can all have different theories of change, but ultimately those theories of change all somehow are rooted in these points. And I found that for me, it was really helpful to me as an organizer in terms of thinking about solutions, because sometimes we might think about solutions and not really realize the impact we have, the impact each of these solutions can have. But then organizing it in terms of these leverage points helps me better figure out how it all plays out.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'll send an email with the book and another article. Yeah, I'll make sure you have that information so everyone can read Leahy's book, which I'm sure you spent a lot of work on, a lot of time and energy. Cool. Does anyone have questions about leverage points, or any questions for Leahy?
Maybe just one thing to add. One thing we talked about in our group, which may have fit better into like the transcending paradigms thing. I think one thing that recently addressed transcending paradigms is the Pope's encyclical. And correct me if that doesn't seem right, but I work with a lot of Quakers here, and one thing that they keep telling me is that when the encyclical came out, it kind of like totally changed their view of how they view climate change, and it made climate change a spiritual call to action, and like rooted in justice and whatever. But that kind of came up in a conversation about paradigms.
Yeah, definitely. I think you bring to light something that's really important in terms of how we typically think about climate change, or, in terms of how a lot of people think it's an individual action or it's related to economic values. And that's exactly what this is about. It's like shifting the conversation into something different. Dana Meadows started this like community living, was like kind of a co-op in Vermont in the 70s and 80s. That was exactly what we're talking about, all about shifting paradigms. And so they spoke about sustainability, not necessarily from like a reducing paper and recycling perspective, which is how most people thought about sustainability at that time. They really thought about it in terms of a spiritual undertaking. So yeah, that's totally true and really accurate.
Any other thoughts or comments? Min, did you have a comment?
A little bit. I noticed that the more I started practicing it and doing it, that dynamics are, but it sounds obvious now, dynamics are different between big group meetings and workshops and presentations versus one-to-ones. And I feel like the emotional / narrative theory of change stuff becomes more prominent when you're in a one-to-one. And I guess that makes sense because you're also establishing a connection with a person, but only one person at a time. And then like for a few workshops and teach-ins we did, we needed more of like information. So I guess I just wanted to put that out there and see if anyone else had a similar experience.
Totally, because I think going off of that, I think relationships are where you can trust each other and actually begin to relay this information or go past information and start thinking about, well, what actually do you believe in? What do you care about? I think that's a really good point. And it really shows the power and like the need for stronger relationships and conversations that go deeper and beyond just the statistics about organizing and about why we're doing divestment and all of that.
Right.
I think that sorry, do you want to add something?
No.
Okay. I think I'm going to pull out a quote from the reading, and it says, paradigm shifts. It talks about how they're hard to make, but there's nothing physical or expensive or even slow in the process of paradigm change. In a single individual, it can happen in a millisecond. All it takes is a click in the mind, a falling of scales from the eyes, a new way of seeing. Whole societies are another matter. They resist challenges to their paradigms harder than they resist anything else. I think that highlights your point about how you can change or have a conversation with someone and more easily affect their mentality and their way of thinking. But in large groups, it's much more difficult. And especially when we're all sort of manipulated with the media, manipulated with marketing and all of that, it's much more difficult to actually change the way people think. And that's like the whole mob mentality situation. But okay, I was going to do a little journaling breakout. I wanted to, but since we don't have time, we won't get into it, but maybe it's something to think about outside of this call. I just wanted you all to think about any time that you debated or argued with someone in the movement, outside the movement, your brother, your cousin, your uncle who's very stubborn or something like that. And just think of a time when you just weren't able to communicate with them. And now that you have these tools, thinking about theory of change and the leverage points, what would you do differently, and what would you say to that person if you had to have that conversation again? So that's just something to keep in mind, especially since it's going to keep happening in the future. No one has the same theory of change, I'm pretty sure. So that I just wanted to pose those thoughts. But I guess we'll just do a quick closing. I wanted to be transparent again with the reinvestment. I care a lot about the project, but again, I just want to offer strategies for thinking critically about solutions. And I do believe that paradigm shift is necessary, and I think that that's part of what divestment and reinvestment seek to do. And I think lastly, I want to end with an invitation for you all to try to hold the complexity in these strategies, complexity in our solutions, to think strategically about the work that you're doing, the work that other people are doing, your group, and your broader organizing life. And be clear, be honest, make an honest assessment about the reality, the truth of the world that we live in, the sexist, racist, economically unjust world that we live in, and understand that that's not up for debate. However, these strategies have varying degrees of potential and can create different amounts of change with different amounts of effort. So the last quote I'll read, and just keeping in mind that there is no single silver bullet. This is just the last paragraph of the piece. Magical leverage points are not easily accessible, even if we know where they are and which direction to push them. There are no cheap tickets to mastery. You have to work hard at it, whether that means rigorously analyzing a system or rigorously casting off your own paradigms and throwing yourself into the humility of not knowing. In the end, it seems that mastery has less to do with pushing leverage points than it does with strategically, profoundly, madly letting go. So I just wanted to leave that as food for thought, and I will be sending up a follow-up email with the article, the book, and also the Vision for Black Lives policy platform, which I'm not sure if y'all have seen it. It's absolutely amazing. I personally believe that we can't create change unless we can mentally, through our thoughts, imagine a different world. We can't manifest anything that we have not previously imagined in our brains. So, and policy platforms are a way to begin to think about that change that we can create. And I think I am extremely happy and grateful for the work that the Movement for Black Lives, all their work that they've done, and a lot of the reinvestment partners put a lot of work into making that happen. So I'm just really excited about that. I hope the climate movement can get it together and do something similar. Yeah, so thank you all for getting on the call. Thank you, Lihi, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Send me an email if you have any questions or comments. So thank you all. Have a good night.
Thank you.